Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Our guest today on EconVersations is one of America's best known and probably most distinguished economists, an economist who throughout his career has defended the principles of economic freedom and limited government, both in his academic work and then also in his work as a nationally syndicated columnist and a frequent contributor to Fox News and a former guest host of the Rush Limbaugh radio program. He holds the John Olin Chair of Economics at George Mason University. He's been a long-time defender of classical liberal ideas and again, just an important inspiration to myself when I was getting into the economics field, and I think to many generations of students who have come since that. So, and with no further ado, I guess I should welcome you to the show. My guest today is Dr. Walter Williams from George Mason University. Walter,
thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, recently you wrote a column noting how we celebrate President's Day every February in the United States, but and we honor George Washington, our first president. But another of the presidents that we should consider maybe honoring on President's Day was James Madison.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about President Madison's contributions.
Well, first of all, I think that George Washington was the most decent American that we've ever had in our history. Really a great man. But just as important as George Washington was James Madison. And James Madison is the acknowledged father of the United States Constitution. And if you look at he was the instrumental person in the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He kind of guided the forces. For example, Hamilton, he wanted to have a president with dictatorial powers. That is the power to veto legislatures. But Madison's vision was a very, very limited government because he wanted a republic. He wanted something that government to do some crucial things that government needs to be done, but he recognized as his colleague, Thomas Paine, that government under the best of circumstances is a necessary evil, under the worst, an intolerable evil. And so James Madison did things like most people, and that a lot of people don't know. He, during the convention, one issue was brought up, and that was, well, should the federal government be able to stop a seceding state? That is, if a state wanted to secede from the compact, should the federal government have the power to stop it? James Madison said no. He said that the states are independent and the federal government is limited. And I think another thing he recognized, although he did not say it, is that, and most Americans don't know it, is that in 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the war between Great Britain and the colonies, and when the Treaty of Paris was signed, it said that there are 13 separate nations. That is, each state was a sovereign nation, and these states they guarded their rights jealously, and they were afraid to give them to the federal government. And so the states came together as principals, and they created the federal government as their agent. And the way the federal government acts today, you would think that is exactly the opposite, that the federal government is the principal and the states are the agents. But and a rather remarkable thing during Madison's career was that he said something that a politician would say today would be political suicide. That is, in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he says, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence." Now, if you look at the federal budget today, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. And the sad part of it, of all this, what we've done to our country, what we've done to the visions of the founders, is that any politician who would live up to his oath of office to uphold and defend the United States Constitution, he would be run out of town on the rail by his constituents, because there's been such a departure from the ideas of personal liberty that we had when we started out as a nation.
But our founders certainly did lay down such a course for our nation, both through their actions at the Constitutional Convention, Madison's writings on the Federalist Papers arguing as to why this Constitution should be adopted by the states, and then also their actions, George Washington and the other founders who set an example, who not only laid out the institutions and principles of freedom, but they actually lived up to those principles as statesmen, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And again, to stress the point of that many Americans don't know, the anti-federalists, they wanted a Bill of Rights added to the United States Constitution, and they said, well, we're not going to ratify the Constitution unless there is a Bill of Rights. And Madison and Hamilton were against a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And Hamilton, in one of the Federalist Papers, he said, why should we say that Congress cannot interfere with people's freedom of speech when we have not authorized it to do so in the first place? And so he said, it is impossible to enumerate all the liberties that people had, and those that were not listed in this Bill of Rights would be taken not to exist. That is, he said that the federal government can only do what we've authorized to do. And another point that we've lost is that in Federalist Paper 45, I think every American should read Federalist 45, because it was written by Madison. And he said that, and as you said, the Federalist Papers were written trying to convince the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution, and other people to ratify the Constitution. And Madison said, the powers that we delegated to the federal government are few and well-defined, and restricted mostly to external affairs. Those left with the people and the states are indefinite and numerous. If you turn that upside down, you'd have what we have today. The powers of the federal government are indefinite and numerous, and the powers of the people and the states are limited.
People only have the freedoms that ended up being laid out for them under the Bill of Rights, sadly. But I mean, there was a framework that served our nation extremely well for decades, or over a century, setting a stage for both political liberty and economic liberty that's led to America's prosperity, right?
You're absolutely right. And if you look at to get an idea of how the federal government was limited, you just look at the progress in federal spending. That is, today the federal government spends somewhere between 27-30% of the GDP, and particularly if you count the kind of off-budget expenditures. Right. And from 1787 until the 1920s, the federal government was just 3% of the GDP, except during wartime. And those people who say we need to have the kind of federal government we have today, you have to ask the question, how in the world did we go from a poor country, a poor, weak country in 1787 and become the mightiest country on the face of this earth by close to 1930 without all the federal spending programs? And matter of fact, I think that we can attribute our richness to the fact that the federal government was very limited during that time. And keep in mind, state and local governments only spent, I think, a total of 9%. So total government spending in our country was roughly about 12% for most of our history. Today, total government spending, federal, state, and local government, is close to 40%.
Well, we've certainly departed from our history. We're in the midst of a presidential election cycle where it seems like the contenders for power are all promising to do for the federal government to do even more. Yeah. And in fact, on the Democratic side, the main contenders are battling with each other to see who's going to have the title of being the most progressive and to expand government even the most. How did we get to a situation where today our contest for election is a contest to see who can have the government spend more or regulate more or control our lives more?
Well, we didn't get here overnight, and means that we won't get out overnight. But I think there's a question that we must ask, and that Americans don't ask, is that Congress does not have any resources of its very own. Moreover, these spending programs, they don't represent congressmen and state legislatures reaching in their own pockets to hand out the money. Moreover, there's no tooth fairy or Santa Claus to give them the money. So when you recognize that government has no resources of its very own, that forces you to recognize that the only way the Congress or state legislator can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. And those who think I'm being too loose with the term intimidation, threats, and coercion, well, you had Monday to check me out on this.
and you could or the day taxes were due.
That's right. You could have written a note to the IRS saying, I'm going to pay for all the constitutionally mandated functions of the federal government, but I'm not having my money to go to bail out big business, to go for welfare, to go for crop subsidies and all this stuff. You would have seen all the intimidation, threats, and coercion that you want to see. And if you acted too ugly, you would go to jail.
Well, I mean, that's such a great point, because I mean, one of my pet peeves is when people in the media or public discourse refer to the government's money as like the public's money. Well, yeah. It's not the public's money; it's our money.
That's
right. They had to take it from us first, and somehow, since it's now in the public sector, somehow we've lost our ability to say how it should be used.
Yes, and what it really boils down to is that Congress. It's really a moral question. That is, Congress is forcibly using one American to serve the purposes of another American. And that is, and I think it's immoral to forcibly use one person to serve the purpose of somebody else. Matter of fact, that's a good working definition of slavery, is the forcible use of one person to serve the purposes of another. Now, I wouldn't want any of the viewers to think, well, gee, this guy doesn't care about his fellow man in need. I think helping one's fellow man in need by reaching into your own pockets to do so is praiseworthy and laudable. Mm-hmm. Helping one's fellow man by reaching into somebody else's pockets to do so, I think is worthy of condemnation. And for the Christians among us, I think when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, he did not mean thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress.
Excellent point. I think one of the things that's particularly disturbing about today's electoral contest is how the Democratic contestants are in effect competing for this title of being the most progressive, because we normally would associate progress with things getting better in our society, our country and our society, and somehow, at least in the modern discourse, we seem to equate government doing more stuff with somehow being a progress. And
yeah,
really,
well, that stems from the progressive movement in the United States that went from roughly 1880, 1890 until 1920 or so. Mm-hmm. And it was during the time of Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson thought that the Constitution of the United States was something that was outdated, that it no longer applied. And he made every effort to try to get rid of the Constitution that he could. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And some of the most damaging institutions to our country were set up during this progressive era, and namely the Federal Reserve Bank and the income tax. That is two devastating programs. And the Federal Reserve Bank had to, for me, and from the evidence I see, the Federal Reserve Bank, through its monetary policy, it enables Congress to steal from the citizens by inflating the currency. Matter of fact, I've suggested to people that if they ever find themselves in court on trial for counterfeiting, they should just tell the judge that they were engaging in monetary policy. And setting up the income tax gave Congress a powerful means to play favors with Americans through the tax code. And most people don't know that the Supreme Court held the income tax unconstitutional on 2 occasions, and it took the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which a lot of people question whether it was done right, to really get the court to uphold the income tax.
If you could explain for us a little bit more, how is it that the income tax it allows the government so much control by I guess adjusting what you're going to tax or what you're not going to tax, and how it ends up being such a instrument of control over what people are going to be able to do with their own money? Yeah,
well, it does 2 things. It provides Congress with a powerful source of revenue so as to be able to play favors with different Americans, to play favors through the tax code, to stimulate, let's say, to give people write-offs for home mortgages, so as to stimulate the real estate business. And if you look at the income tax, the founders of our nation feared an income tax. They feared a direct tax, and indeed, in the Constitution, it says that there can't be a direct tax. And so it took the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, to amend the Constitution, to enable a direct tax. The founders said, well, look, we think that a direct tax is a way to attack individual liberty and individual freedom. And so our country, from 1787 until 1916, until the 16th Amendment, we managed okay from tariffs, sales tax, and the reason why we managed okay from a tariff and a sales tax, excise tax, was because government spending was so small. Yeah. And when government spending gets huge, you're going to have to need a huge source of income, and income tax is a good way to get a huge source of revenue for the government.
And then, I guess a little after the Progressive era, we ended up with the Social Security program coming in, and payroll taxes now collect almost as much money from Americans as the individual income tax does itself, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the Social Security tax was a devastating tax. It occurred during the Roosevelt administration. It was established, but what the Social Security tax, if you look at the legislative debate over the Social Security tax, they promised that the Social Security tax would never be above 3%, and they said that's the maximum. You can just look at the Social Security pamphlet that was printed in 1936. And this is how politicians do. They start out with something small to lure people in so the people will not resist it much. And then once they have them, then they just go roughshod with it.
Because I think they made similar promises about the income tax when it was first being introduced, that only like a handful of rich Americans would ever pay it.
I think it was 1 or 2%.
It would be at very low rates, but later rates ended up getting as high as 94%, which basically is almost government confiscation of our income, right?
That's right. And if you look at something more recently, the alternative income tax, because they wanted to be able to get money from the rich people who are putting their money in no tax securities and things like this. Right. And now a huge percentage of taxpayers are paying the alternative minimum income tax.
Well, so we've certainly seen this, I guess, a watershed shift in how Americans, back from the time of our founding and throughout much of our history, looked upon themselves and looked to government only to sort of lay the ground rules and do the absolutely necessary things, which is a situation where we now turn to government, or too many Americans seem to actually look to government first and foremost to assist them. And I guess that's a part of what we're seeing in our electoral contest, why politicians are trying to run it by saying, like, well, they're promising even more goodies from government. Is it possible that we can scale back the size of government if Americans aren't willing to take on some more personal responsibility for themselves and not look to turn to government?
Well, I think that leads to one of the points I frequently make. I don't blame politicians. That is, politicians are doing precisely what the American people elect them to office to do. And what do American people elect them to office to do? They elect them to office on the promise that the politician will create a favor for them that will be denied another American, or I should say, they will use the power of their office to take what belongs to one American and bring it back to them. That is what we've become, I believe, a nation of thieves in that sense. That is, we're trying to live at the expense of other people. And any politician that would resist that, he would get run out of town. He would not get elected to office. I mean, suppose I were to run for the U.S. Senate from the state of Alabama. Mm-hmm. And I go back and forth across the state, and I say, my fellow citizens, I've read the United States Constitution. If you elect me to office, don't expect for me to bring back highway construction funds, aid to higher education, prescription drugs for seniors, and all these other programs. Do you think the people I would get elected to the Senate from Alabama?
I would hope so. You'd have my vote, but
I would not.
It would be a tough call.
I would not. And the tragedy of it, the true tragedy of it, is that the people of Alabama would be doing the absolute right thing by not electing me to the Senate. The reason why is that if I don't bring back billions of dollars for the people of Alabama, it doesn't mean that Alabamans will pay a lower federal income tax. Mm-hmm. All that it means is that Georgia will get it instead. And so once legalized theft begins, it pays for everybody to participate in it. And those who don't participate in it will wind up holding the brown end of the stick. Mm. And if you have a rural background, you know what the brown end of the stick is like.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier, but I would think it would be good to expand on this a little bit. The idea that when government grants favors to corporations, it's really a very different thing than if we had a true market economy where all businesses would be treated equally. And so, therefore, even if you hear some members of business or representatives of business getting up and asking Congress for some tax break or something, they're not necessarily proponents of limited government in real markets, right?
No, they're asking for favors. Mm-hmm. And in one sense, look, it takes a lot of moral courage for let's say a CEO or a businessman to say, well, look, I'm not going to take any of these favors. I'm not going to take any handouts. Well, what that means is that puts him at a competitive advantage with other businesses that are at a competitive disadvantage with other businesses that are taking the handouts. So when he goes to his stockholders, I mean, I don't know how impressed the stockholder is going to be is when he says, I did not make the return that XYZ Corporation made because I'm going to be moral. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's going to sell with stockholders. So yeah. I don't think that you should ask anybody, a politician or a CEO, to do what he considers to be political or economic suicide. That's the difficulty.
Now, some people would say that before we had government being so large that what we observed in markets itself was somehow unjust. That we had a few rich people or rich businesses that were controlling the economy, and that they had a lot of economic power, and that many of the progressives sort of saw the rise of government as a way to sort of try to tame the power of big business and bring it to heel and make the economies maybe serve the average person's interests better.
I think that's nonsense.
Okay.
I think that's not. Let me take a person like Henry Ford. Mm-hmm. He became very, very rich himself, but he did not benefit from nowhere nearly as much as the common man who was able to have a car that he could afford. If you look at people who invented the vacuum cleaner. You know, rich people have always had people to beat out their rugs, but the vacuum cleaner spared the common man that kind of drudgery. You take like somebody who invented vaccines or antibiotics. They might have become rich, but look how rich we've become because we have antibiotics. I mean, the life expectancy has almost doubled since 1900 in our country, showing that we've benefited immensely. And so we should not allow people to get away with beating up on the rich, people who have served their fellow man. Matter of fact, that's one test of how you served your fellow man. That is, Bill Gates, he did not come around with a gun and say, give me your $400. What he did, he built a Windows system that so pleased his fellow man that the fellow man voluntarily plunked down $200, $300, $400 to buy the Windows program that made him very rich. And so one of the things that we have to do, one of the things that the Johnson Center and other free market think tanks are doing, the only way we can solve our problem is to somehow sell our fellow man on the moral superiority of personal liberty and his main ingredient, limited government. That is, we have to convince our fellow man that freedom and liberty is the moral state is the preferable state of affairs. We can't get politicians to do that. We have to get our fellow man to believe in the moral superiority of personal liberty.
And I guess if they start voting for people who believe in these principles, then maybe we might start to see some change as well.
Maybe so. Yeah, maybe so.
Now, just one last thing I wanted to try and touch on here, because another of the elements of big government that advocates point to is the fact that it does provide welfare assistance to the poor in America, but does somehow suggest that there would be no help for the poor, downtrodden in our society if it wasn't for the government, right? That's never really been true.
Well,
in the
that's
United
nonsense.
States.
I mean, if you ask questions, people say, well, you just have to have food stamps or else poor people are going to die. Well, you have to ask the question, well, when the poor Irish were fleeing the potato famine, arriving on our shores during the 1840s, was there a food stamp program? How in the world did they make it? I mean, I always ask the question when people say we need this program or that program, I always ask, what did we do before it? Because most of these programs are relatively recent. I mean, people say, oh, we need housing and urban development. Well, would the world, housing and urban development came in the 1950s, and we Americans built massive cities, and matter of fact, the cities were better before the HUD than after the HUD,
People weren't exactly living under trees in our cities. We did have urban cities.
That's right,
before HUD came along, right?
Yeah.
And if anything, the federal programs bulldozing neighborhoods certainly didn't end up helping a lot of these neighborhoods
That's
that we're
right.
supposed to be trying to redevelop, right?
And I've often said, so far as welfare is a devastating program. I mean, it saps people's drive. And I've often said, and maybe it's unkind of me to say this, is that the welfare system has done to black Americans what slavery could not have done, the harshest Jim Crow and racism could not have done, namely to destroy the black family. That is at one time in our country, and during pretty bad times for blacks in the 1920s, 19-teens, 85% of black kids lived in two-parent families. Today, it's around 30%. So welfare has been a devastating effect on black America, and it's increasingly become a devastating effect on white Americans as well.
Well, Walter, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, so we'll have to wrap this up here. But it's been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure, and I think an honor to have you on this show. You've been such a principled defender of limited government and freedom over the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.